Vive la Canadienne, vole mon cœur vole. Vive la Canadienne et ses jolis yeux doudou. Et ses jolis yeux doudou, et ses jolis yeux doux. Et ses jolis yeux doudou, et ses jolis yeux doux, ses yeux doux. Nous l'amenons en noces, vole mon cœur vole. Nous l'amenons en noces, dans tous ses beaux atours. Nous l'amenons aux noces, vole mon cœur vole. Nous l'amenons aux noces, dans tous ses beaux atours. Dans tous ses beaux atours, dans tous ses beaux atours. Dans tous ses beaux atours, dans tous ses beaux atours, ses atours. On danse avec nos blondes, vole mon cœur vole. On danse avec nos blondes, nous changeons d'amour. On danse avec nos blondes, vole mon cœur vole. On danse avec nos blondes, nous changeons tour à tour,
Hello, Canada and hockey fans in the United States and Newfoundland.
My delegation would like to submit to the Assembly a very short resolution.
You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters.
Quebec separatism is endorsed by French politicians who have pulled similar movements in Brittany or Corsica.
Here we have the essence and genius of Canadianism, unity through division.
After all, didn't Cromwell say to the artist who drew his picture, who painted him, put in all the warts as well?
It's very preventable. If you're not doing needles and you're not gay, you won't get AIDS probably.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Red Ensign Special, Sovereignty and the Canadian Constitutional Structure. In 2019, the government of British Columbia passed an act, SBC 2019 C44, Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. This act was intended to align British Columbia provincial law with the UN Charter on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, for those who don't know, the province of British Columbia is a patchwork of conflicting Native American land claims, including and maybe especially some of the most valuable territory within the province surrounding the Greater Vancouver area in the delta of the Fraser River. This set of claims, combined with the new legal framework set down in 2019, has greatly intensified the long-standing conflict within the province between those who would like to develop the province in various ways and the Native American tribes who consider the land their birthright. A conflict which has historically been settled via financial settlements between the two parties. The situation has escalated and escalated and escalated since the 2019 Act, culminating most recently in a dispute over Indigenous title over large areas of the city of Richmond in the Greater Vancouver area. Very valuable set of real estate that was recently ruled Indigenous territory by some of the British Columbia courts. Now, without getting too far into this kind of sensational details of this story, it's worth noting that Indigenous title is not the same as private property ownership, and so the consequences to existing landholders in Richmond of this, the imposition of Native American title over their privately held property, are complicated and hard to foresee, and likely the subject of significant legal wrangling. Nevertheless, it is worth noting that the government of British Columbia has responded to this legal crisis by threatening to revoke the 2019 law and setting off a chain of complex negotiations between property holders in the region, resource developers, the British Columbia government, and the Mark Carney federal government. A set of conflicts, the resolution to which is likely to be a kind of negotiated settlement rather than a set of legal claims. However, the conflict allows us an opportunity to see sovereignty in action. The famous legal scholar Carl Schmitt said that the sovereign is he who decides the exception. This is from his famous work, Political Theology. Now, in Political Theology, he lays out the contrast between the moment of exception and decision and the moment of the regular operation of sovereignty. He argues that in the regular operation of legal custom, it is often impossible to see who is sovereign and who is actually making the decision, because all of the actors within the state are trying to collectively take ownership of the decision, right? If everybody agrees that it should be done, every level of government is going to race to kind of take credit for it. And so it becomes very difficult to see the difference between claimed credit and the legitimate exercise of sovereignty within a legal system. However, when various interests come into conflict and a decision has to be made in exception of typical legal custom, there is an opportunity to see which actors within the state are actually sovereign and which actors within the state are simply pretending to be sovereign. Now, Canada has a peculiar constitutional structure, and I mean this in the lowercase c sense of the word, that the structure of sovereignty within our government has, for many years, contained formal acknowledgement of sovereignty and the right to decide in a state of exception. It has contained this formal recognition of the right to decide in the hands of King and Parliament in a number of elements. The notwithstanding clause in the Constitution of both in the Constitution at the level of both the provincial and the federal governments is probably the most famous example of this. However, what was the War Measures Act and more recently has been rebranded the Emergencies Act is probably a better expression of the state of the sovereign exception in the hands of the King and Parliament. And since the King Bing Wing Ding in the 1920s, it has been clear that in actual fact, sovereignty lies not with the King and Parliament, but with Parliament and the executive part of Parliament. So that is the office of the Prime Minister and his cabinet on the one hand, and the broader Parliament more generally as competing holders of sovereignty. And we have seen this exception used consistently through exercised consistently through Canadian history, according to a consistent structure, going back now well over 100 years. Whether it was the conscription crisis in 1917, where the state asserted its right to conscript Canadian men at the point of a gun, literally firing into crowds in Quebec City. Whether it's the FLQ crisis, where the state asserted its monopoly on violence within Canada by declaring martial law and suspending regular judicial operations in the province for a period in excess of a month in order to respond to the FLQ crisis. Whether it is more recently with the invocation of the Emergencies Act in response to protests against the COVID lockdown sweeping the country at the time, resulting in mass arrests, the seizure of private property, and various other exceptions to the normal legal process in the assertion of the sovereignty of Parliament, and in particular the executive part of Parliament in that moment. This is a consistent pattern through Canadian history. I've run examples from 1917 through to 2024, 2022 was when the convoy occurred. However, there are a vast number of lesser examples, lower profile examples typically associated with provincial governments. In the summer of 2025, the government of Nova Scotia used the notwithstanding clause to invoke a ban on transiting through wilderness areas nominally in order to stop forest fires. The argument was that nobody can start a forest fire or put strain on emergency services if nobody is legally allowed in the woods. They applied a $25,000 fine for being caught in the woods, even on your own private property. Extremely heavy-handed, obviously an exception to the normal constitutional order. A number of people were arrested and fined under this quote unquote law, and away we go. Here we have an example in keeping with the long tradition of the exercise of sovereignty from the executive part of Parliament in Canadian legal tradition. Now, as I've walked through that set of examples, you may have your own views as to the validity of the exercise of sovereignty out of the executive part of Parliament, whether this is good, bad, or indifferent in each of the examples, but it has not been unclear through Canadian history where sovereignty resides. Now, we live in an interesting moment in Canadian political history because unlike in 1917 or in 1973 or in the various other historical examples of the invocation of various powers of exception in Canadian legal history, in the last several years, each time the government of Canada has invoked its exceptional powers, most notably in the use of the Emergencies Act during COVID, or in the 2025 fire ban in hiking ban in Nova Scotia, we have seen the court come along months or years later and declare the use of these powers of exception as illegal. Very famously in 2026, late 2025, so first in 2024, then in 2025, again in January 2026, we saw various courts uphold the legal interpretation that the use of the Emergencies Act in response to the truck convoy was illegal. Again, there are a lot of different elements of the use of the Emergencies Act. There was the Coots border blockade. There was the border blockade between Canada and the United States. I believe it was at the bridge it was either at the bridge in Buffalo or the bridge in Detroit. I don't recall which. And then, of course, there was the famous set of mass arrests in Ottawa. So there have been various legal rulings arguing that a variety of these steps, and particularly the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which was especially essential for the mass arrests in Ottawa, was illegal. By the same token, we saw earlier this week civil liberties lawyers win their case against the Nova Scotia government in the Nova Scotia Supreme Court, arguing that the hiking ban in the summer of 2025 was illegal and invalidating the associated fines and various legal sanctions. So we now have this interesting situation where after the fact, the courts have declared the use of the sovereign exception, which is a long tradition held by the executive part of Parliament, as illegal. And because the moment of decision in each of the recent cases, whether the Emergencies Act in Ottawa, whether the use of whether the hiking ban in Nova Scotia, because the use of these powers existed in a moment, whether or not the legal consequences of defying the government in that moment are ultimately overturned, the damage is done. Tim Stevens was still arrested. The truck convoy was still dispersed. The various people who were the targets of the legal of the campaign of legal reprisals to the 2025 or the 2022 protests against the COVID regime were punished via process, even if they are ultimately not punished directly via the use of official legal sanction. In some sense, the damage is done, and yet we have this peculiar situation now where these challenges to the possession of the sovereign power of exception in the hands of the executive part of Parliament have been allowed to be challenged, and we have now in the cases in the case in British Columbia an opportunity to resolve the constitutional question as to whether the powers of exception really do reside in the executive part of the federal and provincial parliament, or whether we now live in a state which is comparable to the American situation where the powers of sovereign exception reside in the courts rather than residing with the king and parliament. And we have it because, unlike for the truck convoy protests, unlike for the Nova Scotia fire bans, the consequences of whatever legal decisions are arrived at with respect to Indigenous title will be long lasting. And so whatever procedure is established for their remedy will affect projects across the country. You can see I've identified a map here of the hundreds of major infrastructure and resource projects throughout Canada that operate within territory under which there is land under acknowledged Indigenous title or under disputed title, etc. All of these projects will have to have some kind of settlement over the issue of Indigenous land claims. And all of those settlements will have to be durable for the lifetime of projects that are likely to last in excess of 30 years. And so we have here an opportunity to settle the question of whether sovereignty genuinely resides within the executive, the way that it has historically resided within the executive in Canada, or whether the courts, in their effort to resolve these land claims, are actually in possession of sovereignty within the country. The seemingly trivial kind of nonsense shakedown that's going on here between Native American groups clearly angling for some kind of financial settlement and the various groups angling to develop Canada's enormous resource riches is actually an opportunity for us to observe the moment of exception in an enduring way and observe where sovereignty actually resides in Canada in 2026. Does it reside as it has for more than 100 years with Parliament, or does it reside with the Supreme Court or courts at various jurisdictions within the country? A fascinating question to which we will be given the answer, for better or for worse, here in the coming years. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you learned something.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.